Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? My name's Susan Smith, and I direct the piano program here at Lewis & Clark, and I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Larry Sherman to you today. Dr. Sherman is a professor of neuroscience at OHSU, and from all of my conversations with him is incredibly interested in the arts and in music in particular. I am thrilled to have him here. He's going to be talking about the brain and music and rhythm, and my hope is that after his talk, the Bartok will be even that more interesting, exciting, and wonderful to listen to. We'll have a Q&A session after the performance of the Bartok, so I hope you stay around for that. Thank you, Dr. Sherman. Welcome.
So it's really nerve-wracking to come to a place where the person who's toasting you is in charge of a piano program and then play piano, especially since that's not what I do for my day job. So I'm a professor at OHSU, as you heard. I'm also the president of the Society for Neuroscience for the state of Oregon. And my day job is actually spent trying to figure out ways to fix people's brains, specifically people with multiple sclerosis and Alzheimer's disease. And so that's something that is really interestingly related to what I'm going to talk to you about today, but it's not my day job. It's not what I do. So what I have done is gone through the literature on the subject of music and the brain, and with a very skeptical eye. And I can tell you, of the hundreds of papers I've read on this subject, I'm not convinced by about 60% of them. I don't think it's good science, and I think there's a lot of things that are being said in this field that are not correct yet, or not confirmed yet, let's say. So what I'm going to talk to you about today are things that were convincing to me as a very skeptical neuroscientist who also happens to love music and attempts with some futility to play it. So if you want your money back, I'm afraid it's too late. You can't get it back. What I want to start with is definitions. When I was in medical school, one of the things that I'll never forget, everything in the brain has a name, every little tiny bump. And the name is usually something in Greek, something in Latin, or it's named after some dead guy. And there's a student sitting in front of me getting very frustrated with the lecturer, and finally said, Professor, do I really need to know all of these names for all these little things, all this minutia? Is it really important for me, for my clinical practice? The professor got a big smile on his face, and he said, that reminds me of a story. It reminds me of a story about a missionary. And this missionary had just finished missionary school and was sent off to an island nation someplace. And this missionary was extraordinarily lazy. And he decided that instead of learning the language of the people, he was going to do something else. He was going to force them to learn English. And what's more, he was so lazy, he thought, instead of actually teaching the people, I'm going to teach the chief and let him teach the people. So this wound up being a session with the chief every day, where they would be walking along and pointing and naming things. And one day they were walking, and the chief looked at this and said, "What's this?" And the missionary said, "Well, chief, that's called a mountain." He said, "Mountain? Yes, that's called a mountain." And then they'd see something like this, and he'd say, "Well, chief, what is this, Mr. Missionary?" And the missionary would say, "Well, chief, those are called flowers." Flowers, that's right, flowers. And this pointing and naming was going on for some time. And eventually they came to a place where there were some bushes, and they heard some rustling, and they parted the bushes, and they saw two of the chief's minions, making out in a clearing. Well, the poor missionary really was not taught how to deal with this particular subject in missionary school. They don't do that. So he thought to himself, what? I'm just going to make something up, and we'll deal with this later. So he finally turned to the chief and said, "Chief, that is called riding a bicycle." And the chief looked at him and said, "That's called riding a bicycle?" Yes, that's right. That's called riding a bicycle. At which point the chief took out a hollowed out bamboo shoot and a poisoned dart, and he shot the man in the clearing, killing him instantly. And the poor woman ran off screaming in the distance. Well, now you can imagine the missionary was truly beside himself and very upset. He finally calmed down enough, and he looked at the chief and said, "Chief, why did you do that? That's terrible. You killed that man. That's awful." And the chief looked at the missionary in the eye and said, "He was riding my bicycle." And this is why we have to have a common language so that we understand each other and there's no misunderstandings. So coming back to neuroscience, this picture here is actually made from a slice of a brain back in the 1800s, and it was the first time that human eyes had seen an entire neuron. The neuron is the basic electrical unit of our brain, the cells that make up the electrical circuits that let us do everything we do. And this particular picture was made by a fellow named Golgi. Golgi has a number of things named after him, including the stain that makes this happen. And the way he did this was really quite remarkable. Nobody knew who he was, so he didn't have his own laboratory when he first came to this university in Padua. And he got there, and he had a one-room apartment and no laboratory. So he would do his teaching and his clinical duties during the day, and he'd come home at night, and he had a little one-room apartment and a kitchen in the room, and on the shelves were bottles of pasta here, and sauces here, and slices of brains here, and toxic chemicals right here. And he'd make himself a little something to eat, and then he'd take out the brain slices and the chemicals, and he'd be eating and pouring toxic chemicals on brains. And finally one night came up with something that worked and allowed us to see the actual structure of these cells that make up our brains. Neurons are unlike other cells because of the way they're structured. Their architecture is amazing. This thing up here in the middle, this is the nucleus, which all cells have, and then this is the cell body, which all cells have. But in addition, neurons have these long branch structures coming off of them, and they can be very long, and these are called dendrites. And those are where the electrical signals enter the cell. And then they can travel down through the cell and then along this long process here, which we call an axon. And the axon transmits the signal to other cells. Axon it means axle, like on a wheel. And then some of these axons are surrounded by a substance called myelin. And this is actually what I study in my laboratory. Myelin is a substance that surrounds these axons. It's called myelin because it looks like marrow, and that's what myelin means. Now, this is a more modern picture of a neuron, an axon actually. This is an electron microscope photograph, and we're looking down the barrel of an axon right here. And these little circles inside this, these are cross-sections through structures called microtubules. And they're sort of the skeleton, if you will, of the axon. And this beautiful material surrounding itself many times around the axon, that's the myelin. And interestingly, myelin is not made by the axon. It's actually made by another cell. This is a piece of the cell that makes the myelin right there, and that's called the oligodendrocyte. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Now, here is a structure that's named after a dead guy. These little interruptions in myelin here are called the nodes of Ranvier because Ranvier discovered them. And what these interruptions do is allows the signal to jump from one node to the next. So basically what myelin does, it's an insulating material that wraps around the axon. But what it does for you is it allows you to increase the speed of your nerve impulse conduction by about 100-fold. So it's a little like if you don't have myelin, it's like driving on I-5 at rush hour, especially right around the 84 interchange there. If you have myelin, it's like driving on the Autobahn in Germany at midnight, where there's no speed limit. It's about a 100-fold difference. So you can imagine that having myelin is going to increase the speed of things happening in your brain, and losing myelin is going to decrease the speed. And this is actually a problem that happens in multiple sclerosis, for example, and Alzheimer's, and just with normal aging. Now here's the cell I told you about that makes the myelin. It's the oligodendrocyte. This is a picture from my own laboratory. We put one of these little cells on a cover slip and used a green dye to show you the structure of it, and it's just an amazing cell. Here's the cell body. The nucleus is right here, and then it has incredible branches that come off of it. Oligo means few, dendro, tree-like, and cyte means cell, and that's a good name for this cell. And what these cells do is those little branches wrap themselves around the axons and provide myelin for up to 40 different cells, different axons. So they're really amazing cells. Now, most of us have more than one neuron, most of us, and the way they are connected is through a structure called the synapse. And synapses are shown here. This is a dendrite, shown a cartoon of a dendrite, and very much enlarged. And you can see that one dendrite has many different axons connecting to it, forming these synapses. But what's remarkable about synapses is they're not physical connections. They're actually chemical connections. So this is a nerve impulse traveling down. This is a little animation here. And you can see, you'll see here there's going to be an axon coming in from here, and it's going to form a synapse with the dendrite, but there's a space between the two, and there's going to be this material that's released into that space and taken up by the dendrite to allow that signal to keep going. And what's happening there is the axon is releasing these chemicals, and we call them neurotransmitters, that then fire into the dendrite. They're taken up by the dendrite and they fire. A lot of the neurological diseases that we now are looking at, drugs to cure, are targeting these chemicals in this very space. Schizophrenia, certain types of depression, other things are all about these molecules not working right. And so we can actually target those molecules in this space. Now the last cell I want to mention is the astrocyte, the star cell. And I always thought these looked a little bit like the really elaborate starfish you sometimes see at the Oregon coast. This is another slide from my laboratory. The blue is the nucleus in this case. We put a little dye to label the nucleus. And the red is the astrocyte. And these are also highly branched cells, and they're really quite amazing. These cells actually account for 70% of the human brain. And for the longest time, people didn't think they were important. In fact, they're called glial cells, glia, which means glue. But in fact, these cells regulate synapses. That space isn't just left open. these feet here from these cells wrap themselves around those synapses and actually regulate what happens at the synapse. These cells also regulate interactions between nerve cells and the bloodstream, and that's going to become important later when we talk about music in the brain, because when your neurons need to do something like play music, they need more energy, and they get that from the bloodstream, and the astrocytes help regulate how much blood gets to those cells. And then the final thing these cells do is they're huge responders to injury. So if there's any damage to the brain, these cells will form scar tissue that sort of walls off the damaged tissue from the undamaged tissue. So you put all those cells together, and this is what you get. This is a human brain. And if I were to take a slice through this brain and then look at a little tiny portion of it just under where that red dot is, this is what you would see. This is an actual section from a brain, and we've stained it in green for the neurons and in red for the glial cells, the astrocytes. And you can see that there's this remarkable architecture. And we have to establish this developmentally when we're embryos, when we're fetuses, when we're children, and we have to maintain it throughout our adult lives for our brains to function properly. We've only recently really discovered ways that this is happening both during development and in the adult. And there's three major processes I want to leave you with this afternoon. One is the formation of new neurons and new glial cells. Neurogenesis, to create new neurons; gliogenesis, to create new glial cells. And what you see in this picture is red cells that haven't decided what they want to be when they grow up yet, and some green cells that have just been born as new neurons, and they're starting to put out and elaborate these dendrites to form new circuits. We now know that this is very critical. Every time you need to learn something in the adult brain, this is happening. The other thing that we have to do is connect these cells once they're born. And this is a process we call synaptogenesis, the creation of synapses. This is a single neuron, and you can see all these blue dots are different synapses on this one cell. And then finally, as I mentioned, myelin has to be formed by those oligodendrocytes, and that's shown right here. Here's a single oligodendrocyte forming myelin for all these axons, and that's a process called myelination. So the question this afternoon is, can music somehow affect all of these processes? And obviously we could all go home now if the answer was no, so I'm going to keep going. Now, in addition to the definitions I just mentioned in neuroscience, one major definition is, of course, what is music? And there are people who would argue that there are things that are called music that shouldn't be. And in fact, some people may have disagreements about what you're going to hear tonight. So, but music, if you couldn't really demonstrate it, you'd only use words to describe it. I think this is the best definition I found. It's organized sound. Now, I love that definition, but it's far too poetic for a neuroscientist. So we're going to use this definition instead. The organized vibrations of air molecules converted into specific signals by the brain. Now, this is really true for any sound if you think about it. Every time we hear anything, all it is vibrating air molecules that are changing the way they vibrate. They're entering our ears, they're going through our auditory apparatus, going through our auditory cortex, and then being interpreted by our memory centers as something that we recognize as specific sounds. But music is a special case, because when we hear music, those air molecules are very information rich, and we'll talk about that more later. Where did music come from? Well, of course, we don't know, but there's a lot of speculation about this, and also how music evolved. One idea is that this is an early form of communication, and you can't see what this says down here, but the one kid is saying to the other, she says, "I've got one with texting capabilities." But in fact, music is very information rich in itself. So if you think about any time you've had to learn a poem or learn a piece of text and recite it by memory, going back and doing that again 30 years from now would be very difficult for you. But if you think about a song that you learned a long time ago and you just start singing it, the lyrics will come back immediately. So you can actually maintain a great deal of information just by putting lyrics to music. Think about how we teach the ABCs to our children. We put it to the tune of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. One of my favorite stories about this, back in the day when slaves were trying to get across to the north from the south, there was actually an underground railroad of sorts in the Cincinnati area. And people would try to get under bridges, literally under the bridges, into Cincinnati, and then they had to get to safe houses from there. Well, all these slaves were illiterate. You couldn't give them directions with written instructions on them, so what they did was they put it all to music. and all they would have to start doing is humming it, and then the music would take over and the lyrics would come to them and they'd know exactly where to go. So this is a very powerful thing. Now, the other thing that is clear is that in almost every culture, music is used in religious practice. And in fact, a lot of music evolved out of religious practice. Even the works of Bach, if you think about it, were somehow involved in religion in some way. And that's certainly true. There's also this theory. So the idea that, why did music evolve and continue to become this really powerful thing in societies? When we stopped being hunter-gatherers and we started getting organized, there were this group of people who were called musicians, who were separate from everybody else and sort of unusual. And they had this amazing thing they were doing. They were creating something pleasant and interesting. And because they had all the time to do that, they obviously had food and shelter covered, which made them very attractive. So the theory goes that the reason that musicians are such great sex symbols is because of this underlying ability to create pleasing things and have stability. That was probably true for Elvis, but it's also true for others. Beethoven got lucky too. So now I have my own favorite theory, and it comes from the comedy routine called The 2,000-Year-Old Man between Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks. Carl Reiner was an interviewer, and Mel Brooks played the 2,000-year-old man. And Carl Reiner would ask the 2,000-year-old man questions about where things came from. And one of the questions was, where does music come from? And the 2,000-year-old man says, well, one day I was out walking, and a lion started eating my foot off. So I called out, a lion is eating my foot off. Somebody call a cop. And people heard that, and they came from all around, and they liked what they heard so much, they started singing along. And before long, everybody was involved in it, right? Now, I think this is as good a theory as any, to be honest with you. But in all seriousness, if we look back in time, it's very clear that music has been with humans as long as we've had society, as long as humans have been around. Take, for example, flutes. In fact, there's a great exhibit out in the hallway here with some amazing flutes in it. These are just cave paintings and etchings from 4 different cultures, all dating back thousands of years, and they all have flutes. There are other cave paintings and dwellings and evidence of musical instruments dating back many thousands of years as well, and that's impressive, but I think more impressive is this finding. So this was a Homo sapien cave. We are all Homo sapiens in this room, I hope. This is a flute that was made out of the wing bone of an extinct species of vulture. And you can see that there's regular holes here, and there's a mouthpiece, and it's a functional flute. This was dated at 35,000 years ago. So this was long before we actually came out of the caves and started. We were still hunter-dwellers then, and it was in Ulm, Germany. Now that's very impressive, but perhaps more impressive was this finding. This was found in a cave that was occupied entirely by Neanderthals. Now, as many of you may know, we now know from genetic sequencing that up to 6% of some Northern European Homo sapiens DNA is now known to be Neanderthal DNA. So we did mingle with the Neanderthals, and maybe some of us have more of that DNA than others, if you know what I mean. But in fact, this cave was purely Neanderthal. There was no evidence that Homo sapiens were there. Now, this is a femur, a leg bone of an extinct species of bear, and it has a hole here, a partial hole here, and then a partial hole here. And people said Neanderthals didn't have music and art. How they knew that is unclear, but they claimed that. And they said this could not possibly be a broken flute. It's rather just a leg bone of a bear that had been bitten by a predator. Now, the regularity of those holes is a little suspicious along those lines. And there's another thing that makes me suspicious about this, and that is that most predators have upper teeth and lower teeth. And if you have lower teeth, then you would expect some sort of scratch mark on the other side of this bone, given how thoroughly centered those holes are there. But there are none. Now, it's possible that this particular predator only had upper teeth and was going this or something, I don't know, but it seems unlikely. The other thing that gives me pause about this is that somebody actually made a model of this, and they put a mouthpiece on it, and when they did that, this is what they heard. Now, that's a diatonic scale, and we weren't supposed to invent that for another 20 or 30,000 years. So either the Neanderthals beat us to the diatonic scale, or that was a very talented saber-toothed tiger. So in all seriousness, is is this really raises a lot of questions about the possibility that our brains are really somehow made for music. And that is a unique thing in the animal world. And we can talk about that at the Q&A session. But one of the things that I've already mentioned is that all cultures have music. So it is sort of something that everybody on the planet somehow has embraced. The other thing is that if you're lucky enough to have a mom who survived childbirth, at some point, it's very, very likely she sang to you. And in fact, it may have been one of the very first things you heard. Mothers do this in every culture instinctively. And maybe some mothers sing better than others, and that's why you grow up to like music or not. But it's something that we all do. So it is something we hear very early. Our brains are experiencing it very early. Our language has musicality to it. And there have been a lot of people who have talked about this. For example, in any culture, not just here in the West, if you call a two-syllable name across a distance, it always comes out, Doris, Freddie. It's not just us who does that. I mean, everybody does this. And then the other thing is children use those same tonal patterns on playgrounds throughout the entire planet. Nya, 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 nya. Or the variation on the theme, nya, 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 right? So this is something our brains do. It's a musical tonal quality that we have, even in our language, even when our language is not particularly musical sounding. Now, the other thing that we all do is we all have this ability to hear particular tones, just single phrases of tones or even single tones, and consider those tone patterns to be either upbeat or sad or melancholy. And in Western culture, those tonal patterns would be something like a bright C chord, and all I have to do is change that one E to an E flat, and it gets much more serious. So what's remarkable is that has an incredible effect on how you phrase music. Composers have been taking advantage of this for a very long time. So let me give you a great example of this. I'm going to play a little phrase from Beethoven's second movement in minor key, and then I'm going to replay it only using the opening and closing chords in a major key. Same chord, just changing it to a major. And see how it affects the entire phrase of the music. Okay, so now I'm going to change that to the major, just the opening and closing chord. I think you'll all agree that that sounds really different. It sounds much more upbeat. It really changes the whole feel of it. So at this point, what I'd like to do is further demonstrate how musical our brains are, because you just heard that and your brains had to process that information, and you just changed the emotional quality of that based on those notes. So what else can our brains do musically? Well, let's do a little neuroscience experiment. This is going to require all of you to do something that I know some of you may find uncomfortable, and that is to sing. Now, some of you sing better, I'm sure, and those of you who sing better should sing louder. But I'd like everybody to do it, because this is something that, again, we all do, and I'd like to hear some real loud voices. So clear those throats. I'm going to start with just a simple scale. And after the scale, I just want you to sing the next note in the scale, okay? Are you ready? All right, here we go. Good, good. How about this one? Great. How about a little blues? So you just did that without even thinking about it. It didn't take any effort at all for you to think about that and say, oh, I'm going to now adjust to the next note in that pattern. It just came to you. And that was because of probably some of you have maybe extensive musical experience, but I suspect some of you don't. And everybody does it just from limited experience. Young children can do it. So this is an incredible thing that our brain can do. Now, something else that's incredible that our brain can do is we can remember songs from our past. And if I were to ask you to sing a song from 20 years ago and not accompany you in any way, you would sing it in the key you learned it in. But if I hit any note on this piano and asked you to start from that note, you could transpose it immediately. Now, I'd like to do a little example of that. I'm going to play a bit of music that I'd like you to sing along with, and the lyrics are a little complicated. It's a song by these guys, who some of you may know. They were a small group from Liverpool, England, called the Beatles, and they had a few hits. And one of them was a song called Hey Jude. Now, the end of Hey Jude has this repetitive lyric that's a little difficult, but I'll put it up here for you. It goes like this. Na, 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 Hey Jude. So I'm going to play that in one key, and we'll go through it a couple times, and then I'm going to hit a different note at the beginning of the next time around, and I want you to keep singing, and I'll stop. And then we'll maybe do it a couple more times, okay? So let's hear that, and if those of you who want to do your best Paul McCartney imitations, feel free to go for it. All right. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. That was great. That was really good. So for those of you who know how to play instruments, transposing from one key to another is not a simple thing to do. But you guys just did it instantaneously without thinking about it. It was effortless. So the brain is really uniquely designed to do some amazing things, and this is one of them. Now, we talked about primitive flutes, and we have somebody here tonight who's, I believe, going to play a marimba piece for us, and we'd like to bring you onto stage, and he's going to show us a little bit about how music has evolved from these basic patterns to something a little more interesting. Take it away. Now, you shared with me that the composer was deaf, correct?
Yes.
So this is a great example of how our brains are incredibly musical, even when a sensory system that you would think would be absolutely required for music is gone. So thank you so much. That was fantastic. Okay. So I'd like to take now this moment to go into a different question, and that is, how does our brain make music? We just heard a fantastic example of a brain that had no auditory function and yet produced an incredibly beautiful piece of music. And we actually use our senses in very different ways when one is gone, of course. And music can be interpreted not only by auditory, but by vibration and other aspects of what those air molecules are doing. So let's talk about what the brain does to compose music. And given that we're going to be hearing a piece from this fellow, I thought we'd use his brain as an example. Now, I don't have Bela Bartok's brain, and to my knowledge, he was never put under an MRI machine and examined, but we've done this to a number of musicians, and we can sort of extrapolate from those studies to what Bela Bartok's brain must have been doing. So the way we look at these things is, in the old days, you would have people come in from the street with a stroke, or they have a brain tumor, or they've been hit in the head or something, and they've lost something. They've lost some function, like the ability to understand rhythm, for example. And then you look at the brain and look where the damage is and say, rhythm must be somewhere around there. Well, we can't really do those kinds of experiments anymore where we're bludgeoning people and bringing them in and finding out where these locations are. So we've come up with a better way to do that, and that is using something called functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. Now, I suspect many of you have had an MRI, and you know that it's a claustrophobic experience and it's extraordinarily loud. But believe it or not, you can calm some people down enough to get them in these things, put noise-canceling headphones on them, and actually get them to do things like play a plastic keyboard and play music, or listen to music. So a lot of what I'm going to be telling you today is from studies like that. Now, the way this thing works is a little different from the MRIs you've probably had. Functional is the difference here, and the functional part comes back to those cells I talked about earlier, the astrocytes that are controlling blood flow and allowing more blood to get to neurons when they need to be functional. When a neuron is active, the nearby cells cause the blood vessels to go from a small diameter to a much larger diameter, and that can be measured by these machines. And so when a brain is doing something like listening to music, it lights up in ways that can be measured using this approach. And in fact, this is a brain map of somebody who's listening to music versus listening to silence, or white noise in this case. So these studies are very powerful. And one of the things that we've been able to do in the field is put people under these machines and challenge them to do things to look at brain function. Bartok was very interesting in terms of the types of things he was doing in terms of challenging musical paradigms. And I think the closest thing we have in terms of data of somebody doing something like that is somebody playing improvisational jazz under an MRI machine. So this is Bela's brain in the act of composing, because a composer and someone who's breaking so many rules is someone who has a very specific type of brain. Not everybody can do this. And the people who can do this, it turns out, have areas here in the frontal cortex that light up in very specific ways that are basically releasing inhibition. Most of us are a bit inhibited. We don't like to draw outside the lines. And the only way we can usually do that is by having a few drinks, maybe too many. Musicians who are great composers and great improvisational performers don't have to have a few drinks. It's already there. So this area of disinhibition is happening, and it happens when you're composing. And other areas are lighting up that are actually remarkably imagining what the instrument that would be playing the music is doing physically. So you're actually imagining the motions. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But this is something that happens in a composer's brain. Now, if you're a composer who writes only instrumental music, we could stop the conversation there. But if you're a composer who also puts music to lyrics, then you're dealing with something a little different. Both you and the person writing the lyrics have to also have a well-developed language center in your brain, and the language centers are a little bit different. Now, Bela Bartok did a lot of things in terms of vocal music. He collected traditional peasant songs and transcribed them and put them to collections of music. But he also did some collaborative work, including a one-hour opera called Bluebeard's Castle, which sounds like something out of a horror film. But but I'd love to see it sometime. But the music was, of course, by Bella, but the libretto was by another Bella, a famous person named Bella Balaz. Now, he would have had different activation centers in his brain that would be responsible for things like understanding language, understanding meter in a very important way, and how to put language to meter, being able to convert words to symbols, which is basically writing, and of course being able to convert those symbols to spoken and sung words. So writing the musical notation and or looking at vocalization. Now, we know a lot about these language centers from old studies involving damaged brains. And the first is an area called Broca's area. And this was a patient that Broca saw in 1861. He only could say one word, and that was tan. Tan. So they called him Tan. And when we look at that area that was damaged in this person's brain when he died, when Tan died, it's this area right here, which we now call Broca's area. And this is an area that's very important because when you have damage to this area, you can understand language, but you cannot produce speech. Anything that you say is not something that you can't form a word properly. It doesn't come out the right way. And you also have a very slurred speech pattern because of muscle control issues that are regulated by this area of the brain. Now, another important language center in the brain was discovered by a fellow named Wernicke, and this is a condition called Wernicke's aphasia that he discovered. And that's another area of the brain right over here, and they actually communicate with each other. There's connections between these two areas. And people who have problems in Wernicke's areas cannot understand language. They can speak very clearly, but the words make absolutely no sense. So they cannot say a sentence that makes any sense at all, but the words come out perfectly clear. So these areas of the brain, in someone who is a lyricist or who is writing librettos, has to be extraordinarily well developed because they have to convert and integrate a lot of information from the written word, but also then convert that to knowledge about music and meter. So you put these two brains together, one which comes up with these lyrics, and the other one which comes up with this music, and they work together in ways that are really fascinating. So when people have done studies to look at people who are trying to write lyrics to songs, music that they hear, and the other way around. And what's remarkable is there are certain people who are very good at this and some who cannot do it. It can only work in one direction. It depends on, again, how developed the language versus music areas of the brain are, or the other way around. Now, the next question is, okay, we've got a piece of music that we've written, now we need to perform it. How does the brain do that? Well, this is something quite remarkable. If you think about what a human brain is doing when it's playing a musical instrument, I would argue it's the most difficult task a brain can do. So think about a violinist, for example. We don't have a violinist here tonight, but this is holding a violin. Just holding the violin in the right position alone takes a great deal of mental activity. But even more so, you have information coming from the fingertips controlling the amount of pressure and the position on the strings. That has to go up through the arm into areas of cortex, motor cortex here, and then sent back down to send signals to make the adjustment for the next movement. The other hand is doing something completely different with this bow. Again, pressure, condition, position, everything else. Everything has to be controlled and sent in a two-way communication stream up the arm to the brain and back. If you're reading music, visual information goes in through the eyes and all the way to the back of the brain, back here, and then other two centers over here where that information is interpreted. That interpreted information then goes to the motor cortex, which then goes and processes itself and goes to the arms, to the fingers, and everything else, and controls all those movements you're doing. If you happen to be hearing what you're playing, information is going in through your ear, through your auditory cortex, again to centers of emotion. You're having an emotional response to what you're playing and hearing, memory areas, and correction areas. So if you hear something that's not right, you have to have all these correction algorithms that are being processed instantaneously and sent back to the centers that control your arms and fingers. And then finally, again, this emotional response is rather quite powerful. You may see a piece of music and have this emotional response to it. You may love it, you may hate it. You may be really annoyed at your partner who keeps missing that one note. All these things are happening simultaneously in the brain. So you have sensory, cognitive, fine motor, gross motor, all integrated into one activity. And that is really quite remarkable. Now, believe it or not, somebody actually put a pianist into an MR machine playing a piece of Bartok. And the piece is from a collection called Microcosmos. And this is a huge collection of over 150 short pieces, going from very simple to very difficult. And the piece they chose was called Triolac. And I've asked Susan if she could play, and she's only gonna play the right hand from this piece. So you can hear, and while she's playing, I'm gonna show you what her brain is actually doing, because they actually scanned this in this study. Thank you, that was great. So that piece was chosen for a specific reason, actually. It doesn't have a very specific rhythmic pattern, and they wanted to rule out rhythm and other aspects. And it was, a piece that people probably had not heard a lot. And so the pianists they put under there, if you average their signals, this is what you see. Various levels of frontal, parietal, other cortices that are integrating into circuit patterns involved in performing that musical piece. And of course, motor cortex, regulating the movement of the right hand. What's amazing is, when they asked people who could read the music the way Susan did, just to read the music or just to think about the music, these are the areas that lit up. And in fact, what it was sort of a less impressive version of the same thing. They're the same areas, just a little bit less activation. So that started leading to a lot of ideas about how we perceive music in our brains. When we start to think about a performance or composing a piece of music, we're lighting up centers that are usually used to control our movements, even though we're not really moving. So I told you about these three processes, neurogenesis and synaptogenesis and myelination. So can playing an instrument somehow drive those processes? And the first question was neurogenesis. And one of the things we know is that if you live to be 124, and that's actually about the oldest documented human being, she was 123 and 160 days, I think. To the moment you die, you're capable of generating new neurons. We didn't know that 20 years ago, and there are days when I wake up thinking that can't be possible. But in fact, it happens throughout life. And it happens in very specific areas of the brain. And one area is called the hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus is a part of our brains that's critical for learning and memory. And we now know that if we interrupt this process of neurogenesis, we prevent learning and memory. It's actually something that happens, unfortunately, in patients undergoing, for example, cancer chemotherapy. They have a lot of learning and memory problems as a result of high-dose chemo. And what's happening in those patients is you're altering this process of neurogenesis. Well, are musicians somehow better off with regards to neurogenesis? Well, one study says yes, and this study was rather interesting. So what you see here is the hippocampus of a musician, and they did this with many musicians, so there's very reproducible data. And in this case, what I mean by a musician is a professional musician, somebody who spends their days pushing themselves to learn new, more complicated music. And what you see in this study is that areas in the hippocampus are lighting up much more than they would in non-musicians, people who are not doing similar activities. And what's more, parts of the hippocampus are actually a little larger in those people, and we know that this kind of activity right here drives the formation of many more neurons, so that makes sense. So there's enhanced neurogenesis, if you will, in people who play music. They're generating more of these circuits. What about myelination? Remember, myelination is that process of the material that's wrapped around the axon many times, and it allows you to go from 5 miles per hour at rush hour to 100 miles per hour on the Autobahn by jumping from these nodes. Well, one of the things we know is that people who have a condition called amusia, And this is not just Uncle John who can't carry a tune. These are people who, when they hear music, they cannot perceive what they're hearing. They have no appreciation for any parts of music. When you look at the brains of those people, interestingly, the myelin is really absent in certain parts of the brain, suggesting that connections between different areas are much slower than they need to be. They cannot have that high-speed Autobahn level processing that you need to understand what you're hearing when you hear music. I can't even imagine what that would be like. That's impressive, but I think more impressive is this study. These are piano students, young children, age less than 11 or around 11, who over the course of a year, or up to 3 years, I believe in some cases for the study, were asked to continue pushing themselves on piano lessons, and they were scanned for the volume of myelin in different parts of their brain over the course of that time. Now, the controls in this study were children who are not taking piano lessons or who are challenging themselves in similar ways, even like a sport. So these were kids who were pretty docile and not doing a lot. And what we found in these children is that over the course of that time, just practicing the piano for up to 11 or 12 minutes a day was enough to drive increased white matter volumes consistent with increased amounts of myelin in these children's brains in several different areas. So that suggests that just the act of playing and learning an instrument and pushing yourself to learn an instrument is enough to increase the speed at which your brain is processing information. Now, the last thing I mentioned was synaptogenesis. These are the connections between different cells, neurons. And what you see here is actually a nerve fiber, and all those little red bits there are individual synapses. One of the things we know is that as we age, the old ideas were that as we age, we just are losing nerve cells. Well, that's not exactly true. We do lose nerve cells, but not as much as we thought. What we're really losing is myelin and synapses. Our brains are shrinking because of those changes. Now, how do you get more myelin? Well, I told you one way, you can practice the piano. But how do you get more synapses? Anytime you push yourself to learn something new, you make new synapses. Now, one of the things we also know is that if you're a neuron, the more synapses you have, the more healthy and happy you're going to be. It's like if I had everybody's cell phone number in here, and I just needed the contact to stay alive, and I could talk to you, and I'd have all this communication. Now, let's say we have a stroke, and half of the audience dies. I'm sorry, it's you guys, but I still got you guys, and I have a lot of communication because there's still quite a few of you. Now, if I've been lazy throughout my life and haven't been good about making connections, I only have 3, let's say, and I lose them, I'm in big trouble. I'm going to die. And that's what happens in the brain. So the more synapses you have, the better. Well, one of the things we know about musicians is they have a lot of synapses. So this is a great study that was done showing electrical activity of the brain, which reflects synaptic activity, in non-musicians versus, again, professional musicians. And you can see this peak here is very small compared to this peak here. This is a logarithmic scale, so it's a very big effect. So that's a really impressive outcome. It suggests that just being somebody who pushes yourself to learn musical instruments can drive increased synapse formation. So the question then is, how complex does the music have to be? So all the things I just told you, all this activity that is driven by things like musical practice will drive neurogenesis, it will drive myelination, it will drive synaptogenesis. But how hard does it have to be? Well, there was one study that really kind of got at this that I was kind of impressed with. They took non-musicians and put them back in that MRI machine and asked them to learn how to play the scales. So actually the scale they were trying to learn was with both hands, simply this. And they did that over and over again until they got it right and were consistently playing the notes correctly and with the right rhythm and everything else. And when they looked at the brains of people doing that, this is what they saw. Now, red is very high activity, and yellow is a little less, and green's a little less. But you can see there's quite a bit of activity throughout the brain. These are slices through different levels of the brain used on an MRI machine. Just the act of playing the scales is causing quite a bit of activity that would drive all those things I just mentioned, neurogenesis and synapse formation. Now, the next thing they did was they took people who had a little bit of musical training and asked them to play a piece that they'd never played before that was a little bit difficult for them. And the piece was something like this. it wasn't much different. The few big differences were areas up here involved in expectations and rules. And why would that be? They had more musical training, they had more of a sense of what those rules are of music, so those areas were being activated. They weren't being activated in people who had no musical experience. So the message of this experiment is, it's not how difficult the music is per se, it's how difficult it is to you. And the more difficult it is to you, the more you're going to drive those processes of neurogenesis, synaptogenesis, and myelination. Now, we've talked about the composer's brain, we've talked about the musician's brain. What about the audience's brain? Now, coming back to those vibrating air molecules, there's a lot of information that's being turned into what we call music there, if we break it down. We have the pitch, which is, of course, the notes, the sound of the notes that we're playing. The tempo, which is, how fast the piece is. Something we call the contour. Is it a kind of an upbeat piece? Is it kind of a downbeat piece? Timbre, which is a really amazing thing that our brain can do. If I were to put a screen up here and play a middle C for exactly 1.0 seconds, and play that same middle C on a violin for exactly 1.0 seconds, without seeing the instrument, you could all say, well, one's a piano and one's a violin. There are people who can't do that. There are people who have damage to that part of the brain who cannot process the source of the music. They cannot distinguish the voice that's making the sound. On the other hand, there are people who can tell you what year of Stradivarius that violin is that's playing that middle C. The loudness is something else. It's obvious how booming and loud it is. And this reverberation quality is also quite remarkable. It's something that we have, if we're in a big open space, it sounds one way. If we're a small closed space, it's more deadening to the sound. Then we have the rhythm. And the rhythm is something that, when we hear a piece of music, we can tap our feet to it, right? Toe tapping is something we all kind of do, and we almost do it unconsciously as well. And rhythm is really quite interesting because it's made up of things that when I think of rhythm, the first thing I think of is a drum beating. That's sort of visually what I come up with when I think of the word rhythm. But in fact, rhythm doesn't have to be a drum beating, and in fact, there may not even be a beat that's obvious to the thing that's generating the rhythm. So in fact, it's derived from the meter of the music in combination with all sorts of accents on the pitch and the tonal qualities, and those all come together, and our brains actually are making this stuff up. We are trying to make sense of the organization of the music, and we put a rhythm to it. And the rhythm may not be obvious right away, but our brains do that. What happens when we do start to finally accept that there's a rhythm in a piece of music is areas throughout the brain actually start firing to a rhythm. You can actually see them lighting up and diminishing on those neural scans. So if we think about a simple regular rhythm like this here, where you have, for example, a strong, weak beat to it. So it's a tone, rest, tone, 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 rest, tone, rest. We can turn that into something very simple rhythm that we understand very regularly. Right, very quickly. But if we do something a little different, our expectations will change. So we might, for example, have something like this. Didn't mean to play the G there, sorry. And this is something we call syncopation, for example. You hear a lot of that, for example, syncopated rhythms in ragtime music. And it throws people off just a little bit. But eventually your brain will adapt to it. So a regular rhythm with a pattern, we adapt to immediately. Our brains immediately start lighting up and start beating to the rhythm. Something like syncopation, it starts to beat with the expectation that there's going to be a note here. But then when there's the rest instead, the strong upbeat is supposed to be, your brain says, wait a minute, and it doesn't entrain anymore, it waits. But if you play that through a few more times, eventually your brain catches up and it starts beating to that rhythm. So it's something our brain does. We're trying to make sense. Rhythm is all about making sense of the overall form of the music. Now, what if there's something a little more interesting going on? If there's a multi-rhythm, if you have multiple types of notes happening. So for example, then you have something else going on. We can hear that a few times and kind of try to make sense of what are those upper notes causing the rhythm or the lower notes causing the rhythm. You can playing it a while for a little bit longer. the lower notes and emphasize those lower notes, that strong beat, those blue dots, that is your brain now accepting that that is the rhythm of the piece. And you can add other rhythms, and your brain's going to try to now bring it all together and make sense of it. In a piece like you're about to hear, where the rhythm is changing constantly, your brain gets a little upset. I mean, it is disturbing to the brain. It's trying to enforce a rhythm on something that's not there. Now, some people don't like that. Some people find it really interesting. And some brains find it more interesting than others, and that might be why we like some types of music and don't like others. So if we look and actually scan where rhythm is in the brain, it's actually localized in several different regions that communicate with each other. And what's really remarkable is once your brain starts to enforce that rhythm, that beat, there's a pattern of lighting up that happens in these connected areas. Some are downstream and some are upstream. If we then impose on top of where rhythm's happening in the brain other things, this is just a few examples, pitch interval and pitch pattern, for example, and some other aspects, eventually you'll look at the brain and realize that just the process of processing music is really involving the entire brain. It's not one hemisphere over the other, it's the entire brain. Much more territory is being used by the brain to process music than language. And that is actually one of the reasons we think that, for example, people who have lost the ability to initiate speech, for example, people with severe Alzheimer's disease, if you play some music for them for their deep, dark past, they will start singing along clear as day, and they actually light up. I mean, these people go from having this kind of almost gone affect to being there, and they'll actually be able to speak for a while after singing sometimes as well. The reason is so much more territory is being used by music, and you're lighting up those areas that are kind of stimulating the areas that are still a little bit damaged, but you're gaining some function. Now, in all cultures, just listening to music can do a lot of physiological things that are regulated by the brain. It can influence your mood. You can come into a place feeling really happy and hear a really sad song and want to go jump off a bridge. You can also, oppositely, be very sad, and it will cheer you up if you hear something more upbeat. It can enhance your attention, and I'll talk about that more in a second. Alter your blood pressure. It's a great way to elicit memories. You hear a piece of music, and we associate music with specific events in our lives. We go back and we think about those events very easily just by hearing a piece of music. And it can elicit very strong emotional responses. There's a little piece that Stravinsky premiered in Paris that caused a riot. And that still happens today. We can really revive people up with music or get them to calm down. Now, listening to music, as you might expect from everything I've just told you, activates a lot of different areas of the brain. I've already showed you some of these. But one of the things involved in memory, of course, emotion, expectations and rules. And again, the expectation and rules could be for rhythm, as I've just mentioned. It can also be for pitch. So for example, you all knew that the next note was a G, but if you hear this, you know that that's wrong. You have these expectations for what patterns of music should be. Attention is something else that is remarkable about the brain. There's this notion that was proposed several years ago called the Mozart effect. It was actually proposed by a French physician. Why he chose Mozart per se, I don't know, but he actually claimed that Mozart per se made you smarter. And somebody did a study where they took college students who, as many of the college students in here know, will almost always do anything for some free pizza, and brought them in and sat some of them down and asked them to listen to some Mozart, and sat another group in silence. And then they all had to take an IQ test. And the ones who listened to Mozart did a little bit better than the ones who didn't. Well, the problem with that study, of course, is that, I don't know about you guys, but when I went to college, a lot of us stayed out pretty late at night sometimes, or were up doing God knows what, and bring you somebody in the next morning, you're fried, you listen to some music, that's gonna wake you up a little bit, the rest of you are gonna probably go right back to sleep. Attention, it turns out, was the real key here. So when that study was done properly to control for that, it turns out the key was that the Mozart effect was just an attention effect. If you need to do something intellectually and your brain's not awake, listening to a little bit of background music that's not going to drive your attention away from the thing you're doing, like make you sing or get up and dance, is enough to actually keep your brain more awake and more attentive. So this is unfortunately, life isn't that easy. Just listening to music isn't going to make you smarter, but it's going to have all these other benefits that I did mention. Now, one of the things that is really remarkable about the audience of any performance is when you are listening to a piece of music, even if you don't have experience with the instrument that's playing that music, your brain is trying to make up in its own way the motions it's going through to make that music. So when you hear a piece of music, you're thinking, your brain is actually lighting up in the same areas that the violinist is lighting up. And if you do have musical experience, you actually are activating the exact same areas. And these are called mirror neurons. This was a study that was done in monkeys. So if you look at brain cells of monkeys who are holding a ball, certain areas of motor cortex light up that control the movements of the hand to hold the ball. Well, when the monkey then looks at somebody picking up and holding a ball, those same areas light up. And this is called the mirror neuron system. And in fact, here's a study where that was done. This is the actual areas that light up in the brain of somebody who's reaching for the ball. This is actually someone who's just watching. And that should look a little familiar because I just showed you recently, earlier, a study where, in fact, the composer's brain and everybody else's brain, we're envisioning things in our heads when we're composing or generating music. So the same thing is happening in the audience's brain. We see in our mind's eye, if you will, the action of the musicians. And that gives us a sense of intention. We also see in our mind's eye the intention of the composer. When you hear a piece of music, a certain pattern, the brain is trying to make sense of it and try to put some intention into what you're hearing. So the reason we have a sad reaction or a happy reaction may have something to do with that whole intent processing that's going on by these mirror neurons. So to me, that's a really remarkable thing that our brains do, because it can actually help you predict if the person next to you is about to steal your beer, or if they're about to play a really beautiful piece of music. So we had Bella's brain, and Bella's brain influenced the function of the musicians' brains, who were challenging themselves by reading the music that Bella wrote, processing that information through their brains, causing all these motor and sensory functions to happen, and emotional responses. And then we have the audience's brains. And these are using mirror neurons to try to understand the intention of the musicians and the composer. But what's interesting is the audience can also then impact on the composer if they're in the room, but also on the musicians. If you have a poor reaction or people see you enjoying yourselves, that actually will alter the way the musician's brain is functioning and make you play better or faster or louder or whatever. So there's this constant feedback of all these brains involved in the process of making music. So I hope you've enjoyed that. We are now going to take a piece of music from Bela Bartok. We are going to have 4 musicians on the stage. We're going to play some Bela Bartok music, and we're going to have your brains respond to it. And afterwards, we'll have some questions and answers. Thank you so much. Susan.